Thank you very much. I'm honored to be here and very deeply moved and honored to receive this award. Growing up, I spent summers in the summer home of my maternal grandmother, Florence Dollier, in New Hampshire. With a friend, I would put on amateur theater performances and spend a lot of time in the woods and the fields that surrounded the house. I had a dog named Cindy. I have had dogs all my life, and they have become a part of my work. Winters, we lived in New York City, and as a child, I went to the Metropolitan Museum and the Museum of Modern Art with my mother. My mother took me to the opera, and I brought my dolls to play with. I remember noticing male and female Wagnerian characters on the stage while playing with the dolls on my lap. My family moved 6 different times within New York before I turned 11. I went to 2 different schools, one progressive and one more conventional. At the more progressive one, I just wanted to paint. For my last 2 years of high school, I was sent to boarding school in Vermont. This continuous displacement led to the forming of an outsider's life view. My memory is that, okay, this is a new place. I have to adjust each time. My father, Curtis Edwards, lived on a boat and was constantly moving around. I never knew when he was going to show up. He spent some time in Mexico every year and had a talent for photography and cooking. He introduced me to the modernist poets and literature. He encouraged me to be an artist, I believe, because he never succeeded in his own attempts at becoming a writer. In graduate school at Columbia University, I studied early 20th century poetry, which greatly affected the way I think about the structure of a work. The form of the haiku was very important to the Imagist poets who were a major influence on me. My parents divorced, and my mother married Dick Turner, a jazz musician in his youth, and also a talented amateur magician, which were both also thwarted talents. My earliest influences were magic shows, in addition to the circus and Broadway musicals, and of course, 50s television and movies. My father's second wife had a sister named Jeanne Reynal, who was a mosaic artist and a collector. She was very involved in the New York art scene of the time and knew Arshile Gorky, Willem de Kooning, Marcel Duchamp, among others. It was through this indirect exposure to this world that I became aware of the contemporary art circles of New York. In university, my studies were in art history, literature, and sculpture. I then went to art school and continued with sculpture while concentrating on drawing being the basic element of my work. When I switched from sculpture to performance in the mid-1960s, I had to think about this new form and consider how to work with it in order to develop a new language. I made this statement at the time. I didn't see a major difference between a poem, a sculpture, a film, or a dance. A gesture has for me the same weight as a drawing. Draw, erase, memory erased. While I was studying art history, I looked carefully at the space of paintings, films, and sculpture, how illusions are created within a framed space, and how to deal with a real physical space with depth and distance. When I switched from sculpture to performance, I just went to a space and looked at it. I would imagine how it would look to an audience, what they would be looking at, and how they would perceive the ambiguities and illusions of the space. An idea for a piece would come just from looking until my vision blurred. I would also begin with a mirror, a cone, a TV, a story. Sassetta and Piero della Francesca are 2 Renaissance painters that I really loved. I was interested in the geometric forms and how the space of architecture was depicted in the space of the city. In Sassetta, I was drawn to the form, the delicate colors, the magic. In Piero, it was the placement of the figures in the space of architecture, how they stood and seemed to gesture. A major direct influence was Alberto Giacometti. His figures, sometimes tiny, sometimes enormous, occupied and commanded a focused space. This element of illusion was also in the circus and the magic shows I had seen as a child. This idea of alchemy, the transformation of material, is essential. From the very beginning, nature has been a context for my work. Since childhood, I have loved the outdoors, playing in the woods in New Hampshire, putting on plays with my friends in various wild gardens, and watching thunderstorms move across the valley. These were high points. The first time I really understood why people made up stories about gods was when I went to the southwest of the United States and saw the landscape there. It was so overwhelming in an unexplainable way that I understood why it had to be explained by myths and stories. When I made Wind in 1968, it was filmed outdoors on the coldest day of the year, though it was based on an indoor piece. The wind became a character and a force. The wind turned what could have been familiar everyday movements into a comedy of chaos. Forces of nature in the landscape continue to be a major presence. I was very influenced by film as well as by modernist poetry and literature. I learned so much from looking at the early films of Vertov, Eisenstein, Pudovkin, Ozu, and others. I was drawn to the idea of one image next to another, and in a related way to the use of a series of close-ups to build a narrative. I was affected by the use of landscape and the contrasting close-ups of animals, flowers, children, and people. The Russians, like other early filmmakers, were attracted to the activities of everyday movement. After seeing silent films, one was more aware of how sound could be used in a particular way. When I was in high school during the 1950s in Northport, Long Island, I saw my first Japanese film. It was called Ugetsu by Kenji Mizoguchi, and it intrigued and startled me at the same time. I was taken aback by its style of acting and its imagery. I had never seen anything like it. I began my study of film by attending film screenings in New York at Anthology Film Archives, established by Jonas Mikas. Recently, they sponsored the restoration of my two films, Wind and Song Delay. Metaphor is an aspect of my visual language. How does one tell a story with sound and image in time? What is the function of an image? In modernist poetry, the structure of the haiku can combine two images to make a third, like Ezra Pound's In the Station of a Metro from 1913. The apparition of these faces in a crowd, petals on a wet black bough. When I began to work in time-based media, I had to invent ways of structuring sequences of images, so I worked with the language of montage in composing my work. In the 1960s, when I knew I wanted to make performance-based work, I attended dance workshops, performances, and happenings by visual artists and dancers in New York. I was also looking at film, painting, and sculpture, how art is a dialogue with the past and the future. I am constantly looking for both familiar and strange objects in flea markets, at home and away, that might become props in my work. The objects I use are not literal adaptations of the elements in the story or concept, but are symbolic, archetypal. For example, the actuality of the form, the cone, was an instrument to channel sound to the audience. I could whisper in their ears, look through it, listen to it, yell through it, sing, always directing sound to a place. Funnel, a piece I did in 1974, was based on the form of a cone. I made many paper cones of different sizes and proportions. I started working with 9-foot tin cones in 1976 and continue to be inspired by this shape. My inspiration includes travel, collecting objects, and the practices of other cultures and their rituals. Ritual is part of my language, my own ritual, although I am interested in the rituals of other cultures. In studying art history, every painting has a story, and many practices begin in ritual. The No Theater began as ritual. I studied the early periods of art, the Minoan and the Mycenaean periods. I spent a year in Greece and several months in Crete because I was drawn to the Minoan myths of the women diving in the sea with the dolphins. In the 1960s, when I was doing research and getting prepared to go into performance, I saw the Hopi snake dance in the Southwest, which was amazing, outdoors, and beautiful. All of these ideas have continued through the years and have been applied in different ways to later works. They have to do with my way of performing, my way of disguising myself and working in relation to the camera. How to alter the image through the various media and then alter what is there later through editing. Using layering devices and reflection to alter how the audience perceives what they see. I've continuously stepped from the making of a performance to making autonomous films and video works to installation and back while moving images and ideas from each to the other. The first prop that I used was the mirror, and as you saw in Wind, we had costumes with mirrors pasted onto them. I got the idea from reading the Argentinian writer Jorge Luis Borges. I was very intrigued by how he wrote about mirrors and space and the infinite multiplication of space as a library, the endless library that went on and on. So I made several performances with mirrors in the late 60s. These pieces consisted of a group of about 17 people walking very slowly, very carefully, moving in choreographed movements in the space. The mirrors faced the audience. In turn, the audience saw the reflected, fractured space, the other performers, and themselves. So what you're seeing now is a recent reconstruction from notes and photographs of Mirror Piece 1 and 2, which was originally performed in the late 60s and 1970. The mirror was a metaphor for me, a device to alter the image and to include the audience reflection, making them uneasy as they view themselves in public. The fragility of the mirrors and glass that could actually break also caused discomfort. Beauty with an edge offset. Other outdoor pieces also involved the viewpoint of the audience. My early work developed in a particular context and place. In the 1960s, some parts of New York looked like ruins, parts of the Lower West Side, for example, and the docks nearby along the Hudson River. These were places to explore. The first outdoor piece, Joan's Beach piece in 1970, was about perception in the distance, how sound is delayed by distance. One sees the action and split seconds later, one hears the sound. Space is flattened by the distance. Certainly one can relate it to the history of painting and representation of flatness and the idea of trying to create the illusion of depth through perspective or color and form. I went to Japan in 1970 and saw the No Theater. It had a significant influence on me and my work. It was then that I started experimenting with masks and used them in the outdoor works. Masks hid my face from the audience and gave me another persona. They inspire me to move in a different way, behave in a different way, and mask my personality, which I like. The sound of wood hitting wood in the No inspired me to work with wood blocks clapping the sound delay in my outdoor performances. What you see now is a piece called Nova Scotia Beach Dance. Although the piece was happening on the beach itself, it was seen from overhead by a group standing on the cliff above. I've spent every summer since 1970 in Cape Breton, Canada, and every summer I record the landscape and perform for the video camera. When I moved to Soho in 1968, it was relatively empty, and artists were able to move into old, recently abandoned factory lofts that had the beauty of another time. It wasn't expensive to find a place to perform or exhibit one's work. You could work on the streets, lots, and docks without getting permission from the city. My performance and video reflected that setting. It was an atmosphere grainy and rough. This performance is Delay, Delay from 1972 with a group of people who, as usual, were friends and artists. For instance, Gordon Matta Clark is in this piece. I would work on location, in this case, the empty lots of the Lower West Side of New York, for a few months with ideas developed previously at Jones Beach and for the Nova Scotia Beach Dance, and then rehearse with a group before performing in public. For Delay, Delay, the audience sat on the roof of a loft building on Chambers Street, overlooking these empty lots where old factory buildings had been recently torn down. This work dealt with the perception of distance from an overhead view. This film, Song Delay, was based on Delay, Delay and shot in this location. In order to recreate the illusion of the space, in other words, the distance and the activity over a wide viewpoint, I worked with the filmmaker Robert Fiore, and we used two lenses, a telephoto lens, since you wouldn't be able to see the sound delay in the distance through a normal lens, and a wide-angle lens to record the area of the empty lots. It was pure accident that boats went by up and down the Hudson River in the background as we recorded. We were very lucky. Every time we started to record the wood clapping sound delay, the boats went by. Here we see an image of Organic Honey's visual telepathy, the first video performance that I ever did. I bought a video camera in Japan in 1970 and started working with closed-circuit video system, which was quite a revolutionary video system at that time. Artists seeing themselves live performing and recording at the same time. This was unlike recording in film, where you can't see the results of a recording until later. It was a radical moment. This device altered my way of performing. I began to perform for the camera. I didn't want to be recognized as myself, so I wore masks. I dressed up, I played with disguise. I developed imaginary characters or states of mind, alter egos. In a way, I found myself in the mirror works and through video transformations. Organic Honey's visual telepathy evolved as I found myself continually investigating my own image in the monitor of my video machine. I then bought a mask of a doll's face, which transformed me into an erotic seductress. I named this TV persona Organic Honey. I became increasingly obsessed with following the process of my own theatricality as my images fluctuated between the narcissistic and a more abstract representation. The risk was to become too submerged in solipsistic gestures. In exploring the possibilities of female imagery, thinking always of a magic show, I attempted to fashion a dialogue between my different disguises and the fantasies they suggested. This was in part inspired by the feminist movement of the time. I always kept my eye on the small monitor in the performance area in order to control the image. There was a live camera in the performance space. At first I operated the camera, but later I had a camera person as performer. All movements and shots were set up beforehand and rehearsed. There is a small monitor in the space so that I, the performer, could frame my actions. The audience saw this live performance simultaneously with the image transmitted from the camera to the projection and/or the monitor. This was often a detail of the live action, so the experience was of a double narrative linked. In subsequent video performances, I continued to explore this space of perception. I am interested in drawing during performance. A drawing in a performance is different than drawing alone in my studio, where there are no witnesses. The performance affects the drawing. As organic honey, I drew for the monitor while looking at the monitor and not at the drawing. I think continuously of how to work with screens, how to design the screen, and how to work with projection on the screen. I am interested in creating my own special effects using my own technological trickery. Mirage from 1976 was designed particularly for the Anthology Film Archives. It was the last of a series of video performances working with early black and white technology, and was structured in relation to the projection screen of the Cinematheque. Because one can change the size and shape of the screen, various movements were performed in relation to those shapes. A large monitor turned on its side played pre-recorded videos, such as May Windows and Good Night, Good Morning. These works were recorded by a camera turned on its side to fit the vertical format. In this piece, I included two 16mm films, a drawing film and a film of volcano eruptions, both projected. However, the screens were mostly blank, serving as backdrops for my movements on the small black wooden table or stage. Sometimes, if the screen was backlit, one could see through it, and we performed behind the screen, working with the transparency. I did not include the live camera linked to the closed circuit. Props included a group of 9-foot tin cones, a small hoop, and a Central American wooden mask of a man. For the 30-minute film shot by Babette Mangold, I made a series of drawings on the blackboard. Drawing and erasing, in this case, images or symbols that were part of my vocabulary. This is a weather symbol and a heart I draw over and over, a basic iconic image. I was inspired by the films of Maya Deren, the American filmmaker who spent time in Haiti filming the voodoo rituals. Practitioners were making drawings over and over again on the dark ground with lines of white powder. I refer to this piece, and I've used this drawing film in other works or as part of the installation version of Mirage. Mirage is a piece that I go back to in order to develop certain aspects of it in new work. It interests me to go back to an early work, take a part of it, and work with it in relation to other material. I'm interested in how the content is altered by juxtaposition or by being in a different context. I sat on top of a television set which was turned on its side in a vertical position and made a series of gestures. The image of the cone inspired me to include volcano footage. The whole piece involved the idea of opposites. It was an abstract piece dealing with light and dark. This is the juniper tree, the first version for children. In 1976, I started working with narrative or storytelling inspired by prose fiction. As with the mirror, the video, the outdoor work, narrative, I would say, was another altering medium in which the image relates to a story and is affected by the story. This is the first version of the juniper tree, based on a fairy tale by the Grimm brothers. It was made for children, which interests me, to have children react and respond to the work. I later altered that piece and turned it into a work not just for children, though children could have seen it. I made a structure, a stage set. For instance, I represented the tree with a ladder, which is an iconic way of representing a tree. The wood and rope structure was a house. I made red and white drawings. When I begin working with a story, I analyze it, take it apart, and I note the colors. In this case, red and white, red as blood and white as snow, very traditional fairy tale colors. In this particular fairy tale, there is a boy and a girl. In the performance for children, we played all the characters. In this version, I represented all the characters. On the red cloth, I drew an anatomical heart and turned it into a face representing the boy. On the white cloth for the girl, I drew a Valentine heart and turned that into a face, each step at a different moment in the performance. I then hung the drawings on the wall. They became part of the stage set. I make drawings in performance relating to the content while exploring each time a different medium. This was in the Whitechapel Gallery in London before it was renovated. It was slightly altered for this beautiful space. Installations are adjusted for various situations. In 1994, I had a show at the Stedelijk Museum in Amsterdam. It was the first time since stage sets that I had a major show of installations that were translations of performances. I also made a new work that was at first an installation and then translated into a performance in collaboration with the theater group in Amsterdam. It was called Revolted by the Thought of Known Places and based on an Irish 8th century epic poem, Sweeney Astray. This is the installation of Organic Honey. I wanted the audience to experience the work in a different way. I take all the elements, the video, the sound, the structures, the screens, the props, and I reconstruct them. In other words, I take the performance apart. So it's not based on linear time, but exists in a different experience of time. The audience chooses what to look at and when. As they walk through the piece, the sounds of the different videos play together. Later, when I started working with more lyrical sound or music, there were different solutions with each installation. This is what interests me now, the form of the installation, this way of exhibiting a work in a space that I construct. This is the installation version of Mirage. As I mentioned earlier, the two films side by side, the drawing film and the film I made to go with it. The second film consisted of footage shot in the early 70s and includes footage shot off the TV at the time, because I wanted to bring everyday current events into the work and juxtapose what I was doing in the privacy of my studio with what was going on in the world around me. Since the juniper tree, when I work with a narrative or a story, I'm very aware of what's going on in the world. The juniper tree relates to the idea of being the female, for instance, and in this case, with Mirage, it's the Vietnam War, Nixon, and so forth. This is the performance version of Volcano Saga. I began to work with projections as colored backdrops, reflecting the narrative and placed in relation to the space of the performance. The video is edited to form a parallel narrative to the live action in and around it. In this case, it's on 3 different screens. 2 projections show continuous moving images, narratives relating to the story. The 3rd screen is behind a piece of glass that I stand behind at times and use as a sounding board, knocking on it or painting on it. The projections are a series of color images or stills that I took when I visited Iceland to work on the piece and record the landscape. I continue to explore this way of telling a story. I do not illustrate the story, I represent it, often using metaphor. The projection and the live performance form parallel narratives. I perform in the image and beside it, always in relation to it. I worked with composer Alvin Lucier. In each of my works, I've either made my own soundtracks or worked with a composer. Tilda Swinton played the main part in Volcano Saga. The characters in an Icelandic saga are more three-dimensional as they are based on real historical figures. Fairy tales were two-dimensional, cardboard cutouts, either good or evil. I wanted to have an experienced performer, in this case Tilda, to play the part of Gudrun, the main character, a woman who was married 4 times. She has a series of 4 dreams that foretold her future. Ron Vauder, an actor from the Worcester Group, played the seer, who interpreted these dreams.
I dreamt I was standing outside near a stream. I was wearing a headdress on my head, but I felt that it didn't become me, so I was anxious to change it. A lot of people warned me not to, but I paid no attention to them, and tore the headdress off my head and threw it into the stream. And that was the end of that dream.
After several large-scale epic works, I started to think in miniature terms and not have myself appear live. I began to make a series of sculptural objects, long wooden boxes echoing the shape of a cone, but squared. Inside, the larger end is a stage with a video backdrop. The viewer stands and looks into the box. This piece was the first one I did. It was called Tap Dancing. It's a poetic documentary about a form of dance that they do in Canada. and it's based on a particular folk dancer. It's called step dancing. This is a little girl. All the children learn these dances, and I made a number of props and objects that represent the stage set within this miniature theater. I've made 6 of these, and they're all different subjects and different shapes. This is My New Theater 3. You can also see another My New Theater behind this. This is another example of drawing in relation to my body. I put a wet sheet over me, and I drew its outlines on the sheet in charcoal. It looks like my skeleton on the outside of my body. After this, I began to do these drawings in performance by tracing over a large piece of Japanese paper held against my body. I've made many of these drawings. The drawing on the blackboard is one of my objects that I collect. So in 1968, when I began to publicly perform, I had the desire to develop my own language, as I've said. I feel the following works, my most recent, are a coming together of all the ideas of the early works. I have developed them into longer and more complicated narratives. And I just wanted to play a video with my dog. So in 1968, when I began to publicly perform, yes, I've already said that, sorry. Lines in the Sand was based on a long poem called Helen in Egypt, written by H.D. or Hilda Doolittle. H.D. was an American writer living in the early part of the 20th century who was analyzed by Sigmund Freud in the 30s. I also include quotes from her memoir, Tribute to Freud. It was written right before the Second World War. I grew up in the Second World War. War is a background condition. There's a section from H.D.'s book about her analysis with Freud that refers to this time before World War II in a certain way. Quote, "There was something beating in my brain." Helen of Troy was blamed for the Trojan War. Of course, a woman had to be blamed. H.D.'s account is based on a classical reference that stated that Helen never went to Troy, but went to Egypt. The Helen that was in Troy was a phantom, a copy, and it was actually a trade war. I was thinking of the fact that we are still at war and that the true reasons are never made explicit. I am interested in these historic, mythic female figures and the echoing theme of the double. For part of my research, I visited Las Vegas, where we recorded scenes in a casino called Luxor. The fake Luxor was juxtaposed against the real Egypt, represented in the work by the photographs that my grandmother took when she visited Egypt at the end of the 19th century. This was an echoing of the theme of the double. I do not play Helen. There are 2 of us performing, echoing the real and the fake. In this case, I'm making a drawing of the step pyramid that involves moving with my body while making a mark on a large piece of paper that's suitable to the scale of the performance space or stage. I often become obsessed with one form, in this case, the pyramid and the Sphinx, drawing the image over and over again in real time for the performance. Around 2003, I started to develop the shape, the scent, the feel of things. The title of the piece is a quote from H.D.'s writing, but the piece was based on a book by Abbe Warburg, Images from the Region of the Pueblo Indians of North America. In the early part of the 20th century, Warburg, a German art historian, visited the Southwest and saw certain ceremonies of an indigenous peoples, the Hopi. Through his writing, I returned to my own memory of seeing the snake dance of the Hopi in Arizona. The piece was designed for an immense space in the basement of an old factory that became the exhibition space of Dia Beacon. In 2005, I began to work with Jason Moran, the jazz composer who composed music and played live in the piece. This has been a long-lasting and important collaboration. We continue to work together for Reading Dante, Reanimation, and They Come to Us Without a Word. I designed a large screen on wheels that moved in and out of the corridor sideways, moving toward and away from the audience, shrinking and expanding the space. The screen appeared as a fourth wall, advancing, receding, and moving out of the space. Major props included a stuffed coyote, a long snake-like structure on wheels, and various sound devices that I played in relation to Jason's sound. Jason was playing live. This piece really developed around the text, which was then developed into a script, which I worked on for 2 years. I also spent 2 years recording video in many locations. My research took me to the desert landscapes of the southwest of America and Southern California, and woods and beaches of Canada. The haunting images from the Salton Sea for me represented the decay of a certain aspect of American culture and became the backdrop for the song Pastures of Plenty by Woody Guthrie, which was an ironic juxtaposition. This scene where I paint the snake is an example of how layers of action occur in relation to the space and the projection. I move with the music to paint the snake in a condensed period of time while the other performer, Ragini Haas, pulls and swings the snake-like row of linked canvases on wheels. Projected behind this is an image of a stick being used as a drawing tool to draw curving lines in the sand. Here is the final scene, only possible because of the unique layout of the Dia space. The character, Warburg, walks down the length of the enormous warehouse space, past the columns. The metal doors roll open, letting in a flood of light as Warburg leaves the sanitarium and the music plays. Reanimation was based on the Icelandic writer Halldór Laxness's Under the Glacier, a work of fiction written in 1968. I shot it partly in Norway and partly in my loft in New York. While in Norway, I met a Sami singer named Ande Sombi. We recorded his songs, which are part of the soundtrack. Jason Moran composed and played the music for the performance version after the first version of the installation was shown in Kassel for Documenta 13. Reanimation was my first piece where I wanted to include questions about the problems in the environment in my work. Of course, I had always been thinking about these things. I was struck by Laxness' writings and its focus on the poetic presence of glaciers, nature, and its creatures. I used crystals in this piece because glaciers are made of crystals. Because my work is always set in the present, I had to take into consideration, when creating the piece, that glaciers are melting. I used footage from a 1973 video called Disturbances, shot in a swimming pool, with shots of women swimming underwater. From my time in Kitakyushu with the CCA, I had worked with Soji screens, so I reconfigured the piece and had these paper screens made for the video projection for Reanimation. It really alters the perception of the image because it divides the image into a grid pattern. The audience can walk into the architectural space and be surrounded by the projected images. Also, part of the piece, but outside of the room-like space, are two large Manu theaters playing other video material. In the performance of Reanimation, I made a drawing with ink and ice. This is an image of the drawing projected through the crystal and metal structure. I thought of the black ink on the white snow as a kind of polluting element. This is just another example of how I work with drawing, and here I draw on the snow with paint. This is an example of how Jason Moran and I work together. I love this motif, and he's reused it in different ways. am making drawings of birds as fast as I can and sliding the pieces of paper away, one after another, inspired by the music, I was particularly inspired by one of Haldor Laxness's description of a bird standing in a storm. They come to us without a word. I was invited to represent the United States at the Venice Biennale in 2005. Again, this is an example of one work segueing into another. I quoted Laxness about bees and the miraculous aspect of how bees function. I wanted to make a piece about animals and include children as performers. For me, this represented the fact of our fragile environment that children will inherit. In each room were two projections, one concerned with the main subject, the bees, the fish, the wind, and the homeroom in which children drew animals, for instance. The other projection concerned ghost stories from the oral tradition of Cape Breton, Canada. I thought of the ghosts of creatures. This video was in the wind room. I find a lot of my props in a friend's antique store in Canada, and that fan is one of them, a giant fan. In this piece, stream or river, flight or pattern, birds are a major presence in the work. I also continue to work with children. I recorded video in Vietnam, Spain, Singapore, and Italy. I projected the videos on the wall in my loft and then performed in front of them and recorded it, as I have done so often throughout the years. The thread of my work from the very beginning has always been my role as performer. I step into a piece and move, guided by the music, the text, the props, and both inspired and working in the space with other performers. These pieces this was made in Santander, Spain, working with some of the people in my workshop, and we worked with shadows, juxtaposing the landscape of the local the local landscape in Santander. I continue to explore these ideas in my recent piece about the ocean, moving off the land. The situation facing the planet is dire, and I am profoundly saddened by this crisis. However, I am grateful through my work to have gained a deeper understanding for creatures both in the ocean and on the land. I believe if we understand the importance of these miraculous creatures, we can better understand ourselves and live in harmony. I just, in closing, would like to, again, of course, I'd like to thank the people that I work with, Sakina Gavigan, David Sherman in New York, Jin Jung in New York, and all the children and people that have performed with me. I really enjoy working with other people. It's one of the reasons I do what I do. But thank you.
Thank you very much. Ms. Jonas, please move to the center of the stage to receive flowers. Jonas さん、ありがとうございました。
Thank you very much indeed, Ms. Jonas.
ありがとうございました。